Well, hello and welcome to Subversive Radio. I'm your host, Keith Giles, and I am so glad to be with you on this podcast. However and whenever you may be listening, I am grateful. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for those who have given me feedback on Facebook and Twitter, on my blog, and the comment section. I appreciate you very, very much. Very open and always open to ideas, thoughts, questions for topics, ideas for topics, comments and those kind of things. It helps me a whole lot, and feedback means a lot to me. This is not a call-in program. We've tried that before, and that didn't work so well. But I still don't ever want this to just be a one-way conversation. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity to dialogue and for there to be a little bit of give and take on these podcasts as much as possible, if not on the podcast itself. I had a couple of quick announcements before we get into our main topic on this podcast. So a few of you may have noticed I've only made a few comments here and there about it. I really honestly don't know how much I can say, which is partly why I've not said a whole lot. But here's what I can tell you. About a year ago, I became the editor for the brand new House to House magazine. It was housetohousemagazine.com. It was an online magazine that was replacing the previous print magazine that House to House Ministries used to have. I was very blessed to be able to do that. We had a vision for something that I really believed in, and we were able to pull it off with the help of about 40 or so contributors and really some of the best writers, bloggers, thinkers, contributors in the organic church movement. All contributed at least one article, but most of them contributed multiple articles. And that's really what made it happen. We were able to publish for over a year, every single business day. We didn't do weekends, but Monday through Friday, we published one brand new article a day. And we did that fairly consistently for almost a whole year. And on various streams of topics, we covered every possible thing we could cover, any possible questions or thoughts or anything you could have or conversations you might want to have about organic church and house church, everything from leadership to what to do with the children to, what to do with when there's conflict in the group, what to do with money, a statement of faith, everything really. And I'm honored to be a part of it, and I was honored to do it, and it was really one of the blessings of my life to be able to do that. However, if you go there now, it's gone. I do not know if it will return, and if it does return, in what form it will return. There have been some shifts and changes at House to House Ministries. I am no longer the editor of the magazine, and that was my choice. So people have been curious because if you go there now, it's gone, and people have been asking me because I used to be the editor, and I see other people just asking the question out in general on Facebook and things like that. Hey, what's going on? And there's a statement. If you go to House Magazine or housetohouse.com, there's a statement there that you can read, which is pretty much as factual as you can get about what's going on. And that's, for the time being, I think that's the most anyone can probably talk about. And I do not really know. I can honestly tell you I don't know what's going to happen in the future as far as House to House goes. Well, here's what I do know. I do know that the organic church movement is bigger than House to House. It was bigger than any one person or any one organization. And so so it doesn't matter. Like the movement, the House to House movement, the house church movement, the organic church movement is not something that people are doing. It's what God is doing. It's what the Holy Spirit is doing in the world through His church, through His people. And that will continue no matter what. No one can stop that. No one's going to stop that. And what I'm also blessed to know is that those 40-something different contributors who contributed to the magazine are still writing. They're still blogging. They're still out there. They're still doing their ministries. They're still speaking and teaching and podcasting and giving away and coaching. Their experience and their background and the wealth of experience that they have to share with people. And I am doing that as well, and I'm still doing that for free. And so I'm encouraged. It's not that. In other words, this is not in any way a negative thing for the house church movement, because God is the one in charge of that, and He hasn't quit, and He won't quit. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to get that off my chest. get that out there. And so let's get into our topic here. This is honestly just something, I hope this isn't just, 25 minutes of me rambling. That's not what I want. I'm hoping to avoid that. But it was just sort of a realization I had the other day, that Constantine, when he rose to power, when he became, quote unquote, the first Christian emperor of Rome, there were some ripples that he created that the modern church is still suffering from. I would say I would call it suffering. We are still sort of bearing, living off the fruit of that decision and that impact on the Christian church. And so, here's what I realized. I realized that I know people who recognize that Constantine had a negative impact on the modern church. But what I also notice is that most people that I know are only aware of, or at least will only emphasize, let's say. I think a lot of them are probably aware of it, but they'll only acknowledge one of the two major things that Constantine was responsible for in the modern church. So I know people in one camp, okay, and there are some people in one camp who all agree that Constantine had a negative impact on the church in that he helped introduce and solidify the church's move away from a family-based one another's style of church orthopraxy, if you will, and he moved it into a clergy-laity distinction where there were sort of these elected or exalted leaders who were the quote-unquote the experts, and they did all the ministry, and then there was the laity who sort of just were the beneficiaries of that of their expertise. And that, so I know people that acknowledge that, and honestly, most of them are the house church, organic church people. They will acknowledge, and will openly, they write about it, they blog about it, they write books about it, they speak about it. They will freely and openly acknowledge that Constantine was the guy who really solidified the church's love affair with, if you will, with power, and lording it over one another in the church, which is something that Jesus didn't want, something Jesus specifically commanded against. And so and I agree with him on that. I totally agree with him. They are absolutely right on that. And so there's a camp of people who look at Constantine and they point to him as he's the guy who screwed us up when it comes to hierarchy, kind of creeping into the church, and that's a bad thing. Now, there's another camp of people who also point to Constantine, and they say that it's Constantine's fault that he brought something into the church that was a bad thing, and they fully acknowledge. They write books about it, blogs about it, they talk about it, they teach about it, they speak about it. They point to Constantine, and they totally acknowledge that what Constantine did was, what he brought into the church that was bad was a sense of the church becoming part of the state, the church being co-opted into a nationalistic entity, patriotism and nationalism becoming something that was part of the DNA of the church, that Constantine also brought in as a result of that nationalism, militarism, participation in the military, and a very pro-violence and away from a non-violence position, which again is against what Jesus taught. Jesus taught us to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us, to do good to those who hate us, to turn the other cheek, to put down the sword, on and on and on and on. And it's Constantine, they will say, and they will point to, and I agree with them, they'll point to Constantine and say he's the one that solidified that movement away from the teachings of Jesus, the sort of proactive love teachings of Jesus, to do good to those who hate you, to do unto others as you would want them to do to you. to do the good to them that you want them to do to you. Even if they don't do it to you, go ahead and do good to them proactively. And so there's a camp of people that point to that. But what I find fascinating is, and again, those people, let me say who those people are. Those people would be people like Ruxy Cavey, Brian Zahnd, Greg Boyd. And by the way, guys that I love, I love their writings in that area. I love their teachings in that area when they, Preston Sprinkle's another one, who would, say, yes, this is a bad thing that Constantine did, that he pulled the church away from the love commands of Jesus and into this sort of corrupted idea of Christianity being something where you could follow Jesus, you could be a Christian, and still be in favor of war and torture and violence against someone because they were not part of your nation. Okay. Now again, I love Greg Boyd, I love Preston Sprinkle and Brian Zahnd and Ruxy Cavey and all those guys. I think they're awesome guys, great guys, good brothers, love them in the Lord. But they're all very pro hierarchy guys, right? They are pastors of mega churches, most of them, and so they would only be sort of anti-Constantine if it's in the area of saying that the violence aspect of it, and the nationalism aspect of it, but not the hierarchy aspect of it. And on the other side, I also see organic church people who would point to Constantine and say, yes, he did horrible things as far as drawing the church away from the one another's and towards a hierarchical clergy-laity divide, but they would not acknowledge that Constantine drew us away into something that was pro-violence and away from the love commands and that kind of thing. And so it was really just a realization that it just kind of occurred to me, like, wow, that's interesting. Now, there's only a couple of people that I know. Now, this is just off the top of my head, so forgive me if I forget to name a name. But there's a couple of people that I know that genuinely sit in the middle of those two extremes. A couple of people, a couple of scholars and teachers and writers and bloggers and authors and those kind of people that do genuinely acknowledge both, that do step back and say, yes, Constantine did these negative things. He did both. He brought the church towards a hierarchy, away from the one another's, and he moved the church away from the love commands of Jesus and towards pro-nationalism and pro-violence and those kinds of things. And those guys would be guys like John Zenz, Herb Montgomery, and Dr. Scott Barchi from UCLA. And I wanted to read just a little bit, if I could, just since we're on this topic. Dr. Barchi, I interviewed him a few years ago, and he's a professor of philosophy at UCLA. I don't know if he's still teaching, but at the time he was. And he's a Christian. He's a philosophy professor, and he's someone who sees both sides of this. And I was talking to him about Constantine and the impact that Constantine had on the church, and here's what he said. He said, quote, "We're still trying to get out from under the cloud that Constantine put over the church. Basically, Constantine decides in the 4th century that he's going to become the sugar daddy of the Christian faith because there has been 4 waves of attempts to get rid of the Christians up to his reign, which involved fierce persecutions. So if you and I were alive at that time, we would have all known somebody who had been under persecution by the empire. Constantine shows up and says he's going to stop all this, and of course, we have to wonder how else he could have done this without God's Spirit being at work on his heart. But be careful, though. I would caution you not to believe him until he puts his sword away. Personally," Barchi says, "I don't think Constantine ever got it. I don't think he ever really understood Jesus." Close quote. And that, by the way, that's from an interview at my blog, just called Scott Barchi Interview. That's from the part 2 of that interview. And and I totally agree with him. He's totally right. I had a series of debates last year, which were available, that were podcasted, between myself and a New Testament scholar. His name was Al Baker. Again, great guy, good brother, love him. He and I disagree, though, on this topic of Constantine. But we had this conversation about Constantine, about how Constantine drew the church away from really some core, essential core DNA teachings of Jesus. And one of them was the teachings of nonviolence, the teachings of proactive love towards people around you, and that the practice of that sort of astounding, radical, just audacious kind of love would be something Jesus says is that's how people will know you're my disciples. If you have this kind of love for one another, if you obey me in my commands to love your brother, to love your neighbor, to love your enemy, and to go above and beyond, to not just love those who love you, but to love even those who hate you. And then he says, by doing that, you will be like your Father in heaven. But also that Constantine did draw the church in this direction. He didn't put down his sword. He made Jesus sort of the symbol of his military success and conquest. That he credited, the power of the cross with his ability to conquer his enemies in battle with a sword. And so that was a bad thing. But he also introduced this idea of, he brought the church closer towards this hierarchical ideas of there being these bishops who were totally in control and in charge. They were the leaders. They made the policy. He kind of set them up as sort of little fiefdoms, little kingdoms. And the church began to be run like tiny little kingdoms, where you would have a king who was the sort of the priest or the bishop figure, and you had subjects who were in your castle. You had these huge buildings that were built for them, and some of them were built for the church, and some of them were pagan temples that had been sort of repurposed, but they were not shacks. Okay, these were nice, very nice temples. And then later on in history, after Constantine, it sort of became necessary to tax those people, and then that was a tithe. And that was not something that came into the church until like 777 A.D. So anyway, that was under Charlemagne. So, and so again, in the debate that I had with Al Baker, and I'm just going to at least concede this part of it, because this is something that that Mr. Baker was very adamant about. His whole thing was that, we can't pin all of the blame for this on Constantine. And I agree with him. He's right about that. Because if you study church history previous to Constantine, you do see, at least in the idea of hierarchy, you see people like Cyprian and others who had very strong pagan backgrounds, who were elevated much too quickly into leadership in the early church, and brought with them very hierarchical ideas of what it meant to be a leader in the church. And he advanced that pretty far. And there's others as well, not just Cyprian, but there's others as well that sort of elevated the bishop a little higher than they should have. So again, it wasn't something we can say, well, everything was just peachy beautiful until Constantine showed up and he's the guy, who peed in the Cheerios. No, he's not the one who introduced all of those bad ideas. I would say he is the one who brought the church all the way across the finish line, if you will, or across the goal line, over into a pro-nationalism, pro-military, and a pro-violence against the enemies of the state kind of a thing, where you could be a Christian if you agreed with a set of doctrines, and that's what made you a Christian, not the fact that you were a follower of Jesus who very closely kept the commands of Jesus. Because previous to Constantine, that is more of what it meant to be a Christian, was someone who kept the teachings of Jesus. And that very much included this idea of not doing violence, not retaliating, not killing, those kinds of things. And the early church fathers are very, very vocal about that. I have read a few things recently where people have made claims that, the early church fathers said nothing about this. They weren't against the military. They weren't against violence. You really can't find anything. That is absolutely false. I have done so much research on this. I have books and books and books on this. I'm telling you, that is not the case. That is not the truth. Now, I will concede something on this point, that there are instances of Christians previous to Constantine who were members of the military. Yes, that is true. However, they were non-combatants. And we also see in the same documents that would reveal that, oh my gosh, there were Christians in the army, in this Roman army, or there were Christians, participating in these military actions. Oh my gosh, this is horrible. How could this happen? Well, they were, if you keep reading those same documents, you'll see that they are identified as being Christians, and they are identified as non-combatants. What they were people, by the way, most of the people who were members of the Christian church in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century were extremely poor. I say most of them, not all of them, but most of them were extremely poor. And the only way that you could support your family would be to, if you didn't know a trade, that you could make baskets and sell them in the marketplace or that kind of thing. Or if you didn't, you couldn't be a shepherd or something like that, you would either sell yourself into an indentured servitude to be a slave for a certain amount of time to earn some money and to take care of your family and yourself, or B, you would join the military, which Rome was very happy to do because they'd had a lot of wars and needed a lot of people to keep going, to keep the military going. But you had an option to say that you would be in the military, which would give you room and board and 4 squares a day, and would take care of you financially. You wouldn't starve to death, but you would perform a task other than to be a warrior who carried a sword or a spear or went into battle. You would be an armor bearer. You would carry the water. You would take care of the horses. You would, repair the chariots. You'd be a cook, things like this, because they did have other tasks that needed to be done that were not necessarily directly involved with combat. So yes, I will concede you can find evidences in the early church where Christians were members of the military, but they were very specifically not combatants. And the early church fathers were very vocal about that fact, that if someone was a Christian and they did participate in the military in the sense that they were carrying the sword, using the sword, employing the sword, that they must stop that, or they would no longer be considered a Christian. They would no longer be welcome at the communion table. That is the evidence we see in the early church. So anyway, I just wanted to discuss that, kind of get that out there and bring that topic up. And again, it's just something that kind of struck me as, wow, interesting. It's interesting to me that there are people on both sides, on both extremes, who can very clearly look at church history, but how some people can only acknowledge Constantine's complicity in the nationalism or the violence, but not acknowledge the hierarchy idea. Or they can look at the hierarchy that he brought into the church, but then conveniently not acknowledge the nationalism and the violence aspect that he introduced to the church as well. Because that is, he did both. I mean, if we're honest about it, if we do look at church history, we have to be honest and say that Constantine, that he did both of those things. He absolutely had a very huge role to play in both of those things. When he, as the emperor, declared Christianity the state religion of Rome, or at least legitimized Christianity as how would you say it, a favored religion of Rome, if not quote unquote the official religion of Rome, because he still entertained all those other religions as well. The pagan religions were still practiced at the same time. That it didn't come until later on that we had sort of the Holy Roman Empire, but quote here before I close out here. This is another quote from Scott Barber I did with him. And he says this. He says, one of the things that's largely not known is that Constantine himself was already a monotheist previous to his conversion to Christianity. He's not leaving polytheism to become a monotheist when he decides to become favorable to the Christians. Before that, he worshipped one god whom he was willing to call, along with the other traditional names of the high god, either Zeus among the Greeks or Jupiter among the Romans. But Zeus and Jupiter, Barchi says, are both kick-ass gods. In any case, that's who he worships. And so when Constantine stands up and says that Jesus is God, he's saying that Jesus is the son of Zeus, a kick-ass god. We would point our fingers to brought into the church, and you have to all acknowledge that he's the guy who brought militarism, nationalism, and pro-violence into the church. That before him, these things were not common. And if you're someone who recognizes that Constantine was the guy we point our finger to say he's the reason why the church has moved towards nationalism, towards a pro-military, pro-violent stance, you also have to acknowledge that he's also the person that we would point our finger to say it's because of him and what he did that the church moved away from the practice of the one another's, the 58 one another's in the church, and towards this idea of a false clergy-laity divide. And by the way, if you go to my blog, I've got, you can search biblical scholarship in support of non-hierarchy in the church. And this is from Wednesday, October the 15th, 2008, and I have just nothing but quote after quote after quote after quote of New Testament scholars backing up this idea that previous to Constantine, this idea of a clergy and laity divide is not something that Jesus taught. It's not something that Jesus did. It's not something the early church did. And it was not a good thing when it came into the church, and it largely came into the church because of the influence of the Emperor Constantine. Anyway, that's probably going to do it for this podcast. I appreciate your listening. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful new year, and I'm looking forward to many good things in the year ahead. By the way, real quick, I am going to start writing my new book, at least 2 books I'm hoping to write this year, but the book I'm going to start writing very soon is a book about the New Covenant and how important New Covenant theology is. Because I think most Christians, honestly, other than knowing that there is an Old Covenant and the New Covenant, that there is something called a New Covenant, most Christians, it stops right there. They can't tell you anything about the New Covenant. They don't know what the New Covenant is. They don't know what it says. They don't know how it's different from the Old Covenant. And they don't know how the New Covenant, what is it about the New Covenant that it's so wonderful. And because honestly, in practice, most Christians are still following, in my opinion, or my observation, most Christians are still Old Covenant Christians. They're not New Covenant Christians. And that's a huge problem. And that's why I need to write this book, which I've been putting together all this past year in 2014, and I'm finally ready to sit down and start writing it. And hopefully we'll get it published this year, 2015. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. God bless. Good night. Let the kingdom come.